So, Doctor Strange 2, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, is finally out in theaters, and in preparation for the sequel, I decided to go back and rewatch the original Doctor Strange movie. Now, watching Doctor Strange again, I was really reminded about how different this film was to the rest of the MCU movies at the time, and how much of a risk this movie was for Marvel when it first came out. I was also reminded as to why I really like this film, and why it was such a success, and really what makes Stephen Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, such a beloved character, and why he is one of the most recognized players of the MCU. So the movie starts out, like with his comic book counterpart, Stephen Strange is a highly praised and skilled surgeon. And even though this praise is well earned, he does allow it to go to his head, and he can come off as having a somewhat superior attitude. Now, given he is a superior doctor, his skills are no joke. He's the real deal. But he doesn't know how to be humble about it, and unfortunately for Stephen, he's about to be humbled quite a bit. Stephen Strange, like his comic book counterpart, ends up in a horrific car accident, and his greatest tool, his hands, are damaged so bad that he is unable to perform his job as a surgeon. He has lost his steady hands, which, if you know anything about being a surgeon, that is something that is absolutely vital to being a surgeon. That's why not everyone can do that job. You have to have very, very steady hands, because if you make one mistake, you could kill somebody, trying to perform an operation on them. So, yeah, Stephen losing his, the ability to steady his hands as well as he does, that's a pretty big freaking deal. And considering that this is his entire life, this is what his entire life is about, his career as a surgeon, this is absolutely devastating for Stephen. And that's why he wakes up horrified by the condition of his ruined hands. His love interest, Christine, tries to comfort him. And despite her trying to reach out to him, Strange ends up rejecting her comfort. He mistakes it for pity, and of course, his pride, which, by this point in the film, we see on display quite a bit, his pride will not allow him to be pitied, so he ends up pushing Christine away, and that's ultimately going to end up biting him in the ass in the sequel, but we'll talk more about that in my review of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which will be coming out later today, later on. So, but yeah, he ends up pushing everybody away, and he pushes Christine away even more than she already was. And, at this point, Strange is desperate. He seeks out every possible avenue known to science in an effort to repair his hands and try to get his life back. But he meets with failure at every single turn, ultimately leading him into despair. He is told, however, that a man who was seemingly paralyzed for life somehow regained the ability to walk, almost like a miracle. And at first, Strange doesn't believe this. Again, Strange is a very materialistic skeptic at this point, so, he only believes in what science can show him and nothing else. Strange doesn't believe that this is possible, but, at his wit's end, he eventually tracks down the man, and the man ends up telling Doctor Strange, Stephen Strange, some rather cryptic and, to Strange, almost unbelievable information. The man tells Strange to go to a place called Carmitage and speak to a mysterious person known as the Ancient One, who serves as the Sorcerer Supreme, who, like the name suggests, is the greatest sorcerer or sorceress in the universe. She is the leader of the Masters of the Mystic Arts, and when Stephen Strange is brought before her by Carl Amadeus Mordo, she opens Stephen's eyes to the greater scope of reality beyond what he can perceive with his five senses and with the tools of scientific reasoning. Now, I'm going to pause right here on the story recap, and I'm just going to spend quite a bit of time gushing over how much I love this origin story. I'm going to tell you right now, Stephen Strange's origin story, how he ends up, getting into the mystic arts, becoming Doctor Strange, to me, it is one of the best origin stories in comics. It really is. I love this origin story, and it's really this origin story, and the character development of Stephen Strange, it's what makes him one of my favorite superheroes from comic books. Stephen starts out again as this very materialistic, very science focused, you can almost say atheistic, mindset. That's who Stephen is. He only believes in what science can show him. He only believes in what he can perceive with his five senses. And he goes from that to, falling to this pit of desperation and despair, having lost everything. His previous life is gone. This life of science and materialism, it's gone. And now he's desperate, and he seeks out, spiritualism. He seeks out mysticism. And, that's where he turns to try and solve the, solve this problem. And even at, it's such a stubborn thing, his skepticism. Even when he is confronted by the Ancient One, at first he doesn't really, believe that any of this is possible. He doesn't believe in the power, ironically, he doesn't believe in the power of belief. And so at first, he's turned away by all this, but the Ancient One opens his eyes up to a greater reality, to the astral plane, to his astral body, to these different dimensions. And when his eyes are open, everything that he once thought mattered suddenly doesn't matter. He's brought to this point to where, he realizes that as a human being, he's limited. Science doesn't have all the answers, and he can't understand everything because reality is so much bigger than what we're able to perceive. And that really, I love this because it's a story that really should humble all of us and make us realize that as human beings, we're limited. We have a limited ability to perceive the world around us. We have a limited ability to, really understand the greater scope of reality. I'm of the personal belief, that human beings, the amount of knowledge that we've acquired throughout our history is basically just a fraction of a percentage, a fraction of 1% of the total knowledge that there is to find in the universe. And we're probably never going to understand it all. We're probably never going to have a complete picture of reality. And so to try and, say, like we know everything and, science tells us everything. And, you have to realize that science is just a tool that we created. It's just something, that an imperfect, flawed species created to try and make sense of the universe. So it has its limits, it has its shortcomings, and it can't always be relied on. I personally try and blend, in my own life, I try to blend different aspects of science, philosophy, spiritualism, and religion all together. I try to make everything work hand in hand because I don't think any of these things need to be mutually exclusive. A lot of times people will say it's science versus religion. I don't think it needs to be that way. I think we've just made it that way, and we've created this false dichotomy in society that, I think is really holding us back more than anything. I don't think science has all the answers. I think religion is trying to get the answers. I think science is trying to get the answers. I think it's just different tools reaching out for the same goal. And, these things can all work hand in hand. And this is a lesson that Stephen Strange has to learn in this movie. And I think if we all learn this lesson, I think if we all had this moment of coming to realize, that we don't know everything and that there are, many ways to figure out these answers, I think the world would be a much better place. There is a point after Stephen Strange is open to the greater scope of reality. He's on his knees, before the Ancient One, reaching out to her, and he's like, please teach me. Like, you can see how desperate he is for knowledge. You can see how, this stubborn, hard-headed skeptic is suddenly, all that has melted away. His hard exterior has melted away, and now his mind is open to these greater realities. And I wish we could all have that humbling moment that Stephen Strange has in this film. Of course, without having to go through a car accident. I don't want everybody to go through that and end up losing the ability to use their hands properly. But if we could all, spiritually have that moment of humbleness, to where we realize that, we as an individual and we as a species, we don't know as much as we think. And, the world is so much larger than we can ever possibly comprehend. If we could all have that moment, I think the world would be a much better place. So, Strange having that moment and going from this hard skeptic to this believer, it's something that really does appeal to me because I consider myself to be very spiritually and philosophically minded. And I'm also very much interested in science, but I think all of it can work together. Strange having that transition from a hard skeptic to being, more of a believer and, more open-minded. It's very compelling to me. I absolutely love it, and it's that origin story, and I think the film adapts that origin story so well, but it's so appealing to me, and I love seeing it portrayed on screen. Absolutely love it. And I think overall, when you really look at this whole development of Stephen Strange, from being this skeptic to being this believer, it's really a process that all the world's major and legitimate religions and the great philosophers all talk about, which is this idea of letting go of the ego to find the true self. Letting go of all these things in life that are not really all that important. They're just distractions, they're lies, they're delusions, they're meaningless in the grand scheme of things, and finding what really matters, that greater, objective, universal, divine, cosmic truth. And that's what, Stephen, going from being this very world-centered person to being, open to these greater realities, that's what it's really all about, his origin story. He ends up, letting go of the man he used to be, the false man, in a sense, the false Stephen Strange, and embracing who he really is, letting go of the lies, that he was living in, this false materialistic life, and really opening himself up to these greater truths and this greater objective reality, the greater scope of reality. And that's really something that all the great religions and philosophers really do talk about, and it's really encapsulated here in the origin story of Doctor Strange, which is, another reason why I love this story, this origin story, and this character so much. That's really the core of why I love this movie so much. So that being said, let's pick up the plot once again now that I got that out of my system. I was really excited to do this review just to talk about, Strange's origin story, because to me that's really the best part of the film. So let's go ahead and pick up with the rest of the film. So here at this point, even though Stephen is very much open to learning the mystic arts, the Ancient One is hesitant to train him because she is afraid another one of her students might become like the villain of this movie, who is Caecilius. And Caecilius, along with his followers, betrayed the masters of the mystic arts. They form a group of zealots who seek to bring in the dark dimension and a demonic entity known as Dormammu into the earth. And they believe that Dormammu will grant them eternal life and possibly reunite Caecilius with his deceased wife and child. Despite warnings from the Ancient One that Dormammu and the Dark Dimension would essentially bring hell on Earth instead, he is bound and determined to go through with this plan anyways. However, as we learn later on, they do have, some good reason to disregard the Ancient One's warnings, because it turns out the Ancient One has been hiding a dark secret from basically everyone. And I suppose at this point, this is as good a time as any to bring up the big controversy of the character of the Ancient One in this film. So, in the original Doctor Strange comic book storyline, the Ancient One was a Tibetan man, rather than a Celtic woman. And Marvel and Disney, they've been accused in the past of whitewashing because of the race change in regards to this character. But to be honest with you, I'm kind of two minds on this issue. On the one hand, I would prefer the movies to be as accurate to the comics as possible. However, at the same time, I understand that these movies are adaptations of the comic books and not one-to-one retellings of the original stories, mainly because some of the original comic book storylines just wouldn't work as well when translated directly into film. In the case of the Ancient One, I would prefer them to have cast the character as a Tibetan wise man, but at the same time, I do really like the portrayal of Tilda Swinton, the actress who plays the Ancient One in this film. She does give off that wise and powerful mystic vibe, and she does a damn good job with the role. When it comes to the Ancient One, it's not a character who is really iconic and is more of a B-tier character, in the sense of the Ancient One is a supporting character to Doctor Strange. So I tend to look at the casting of Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One the same way that I would look at the casting of Jeffrey Wright as Jim Gordon in the Batman movie that came out recently. When it comes to, the A-tier characters, the A-list characters, like Superman or Batman or Doctor Strange, you really can't change their appearance because they are so iconic, they are so well known. But when it comes to their supporting cast, I do think you have a little bit of wiggle room. I do think you have a little bit more freedom on how you portray the characters, which is why I never really had an issue, with a Black Jim Gordon. And I thought that Jeffrey Wright did a really good job in the Batman. By the way, there will be a review of the Batman coming out, shortly in the near future. And this is the same reason why I don't really have an issue with a Celtic female Ancient One portrayal either. However, what does bother me is the real reason as to why they recast the character. And it wasn't for anything creative or anything like that. It was due to the controversy between Tibet and China. The Chinese market is huge for Hollywood, and they do some really, I would say cowardly stuff to appeal to the Chinese market. And this was clearly an example of that. So I don't have a problem with the recasting in and of itself, but I do have a problem with the reason why the recasting happened. And that is, to not stir up controversy with the Chinese government. So, that I do have a problem with. And Hollywood needs to grow a freaking spine and stand up to the Chinese government. And that's a very complex topic, and, I'm not going to go into detail about it in this video. That's probably better off for its own separate video, but, again, I just wanted to get that out there and get my views on it. But again, in regards to Tilda Swinton herself as the Ancient One, her performance, I think, is actually really, really good. Alright, so getting back to the plot, eventually Mordo convinces the Ancient One to train Steven, and he begins learning the mystic arts under Mordo's guidance as well as that of Wong the Librarian, which ultimately leads to the conflict with Caecilius and his zealots. It is during this conflict that we learn the truth of the Ancient One and why she is so ancient. She has been drawing her power from the dark dimension to prolong her life for thousands of years. Yes, the same dark dimension that Dormammu is from. So Caecilius is correct that the dark dimension and Dormammu would give eternal life to him because, well, it gives eternal life to Caecilius. So yeah, he is correct in that regards. And this revelation is what led to his betrayal in the first place. It is also this revelation that ends up shattering the faith of Mordo himself, his faith in the Ancient One and his faith in the Masters of the Mystic Arts, which will result in him leaving the Mystic Arts Masters and turning his back on the Order by the end of the film. So during the conflict with the Zealots, the Ancient One is fatally injured and decides to ultimately accept her fate after all this time of, extending her life. And despite his faith being shattered, Mordo does accompany Doctor Strange and Wong in protecting the Sanctums, which are specific locations on Earth which generate a shield protecting the world from Dormammu and the Dark Dimension. And at this point, I gotta say, man, when it comes to the special effects, especially when it comes to the special effects during all the fighting and stuff in this film, they were amazing for the time that this film came out. And I remember being in awe at seeing the film for the first time. Every fight in this movie is freaking eye candy. There was a lot of doubt leading up to this movie if they could pull off the crazy stunts associated with the Doctor Strange character, because in the comic books, Doctor Strange stories involve some insane esoterical stuff. But they did it. They pulled it off. Mission accomplished. And, when you're watching this movie, it makes for a dazzling experience. And every time Doctor Strange, going forward is in the MCU, like in Spider-Man No Way Home, and even in Doctor Strange 2, there's a lot of eye candy on screen. It's an absolute spectacle to see his powers and the powers of the mystic arts on display. But of course, in the end, Caecilius succeeds in casting the spell to merge the Dark Dimension with Earth, leading to Doctor Strange using the Eye of Agamotto, an ancient relic which we learn actually contains the Time Stone, one of the Infinity Stones, and will of course be important to Infinity War and Endgame later on. But he uses the stone to trap Dormammu in a time loop, which forces the dark entity to make a deal with Stephen Strange to escape. Dormammu agrees to leave and never threaten Earth again, while also taking Caecilius and the Zealots with him, thus granting them, ironically, the eternal life they desired, but it's an eternity of suffering. Now, I gotta say, despite Caecilius not being a particularly memorable villain, you do have to kind of feel bad for the guy. I mean, he did lose his family, and that type of desperation can lead a person to do incredibly horrific things, which, ironically is actually a plot point that comes up in Doctor Strange 2. And now I'm kind of wondering, was that done on purpose to kind of tie the two films thematically together? Probably not, but that's an interesting little thread. And again, I'll talk more about that in the Doctor Strange 2 review. Now, when it comes to Caecilius, obviously he did have to be stopped before he brought, basically hell on earth. But to be trapped in the dark dimension forever just because he missed his dead family, that's kind of messed up. I kind of wish that maybe he could have just straight out died, and that way he could have been reunited with his family. I'm just saying, I can think of much worse villains in the MCU that deserve eternal torment. I think that punishment for Caecilius was a bit overkill. I doubt we'll ever see him again, but hopefully he does find a way to finally die and pass over to see his family and find some kind of peace, because it is kind of tragic what happened to him, and I don't think he deserved that. Again, he was a bad dude, he had to be stopped, but I think his punishment was kind of overkill, to be honest. So after the battle, as mentioned before, Mordo does end up leaving the Mystics and goes off to begin a campaign against them. We see him, in the credits scene approaching the man from earlier in the movie who was paralyzed, and Mordo steals the magic that healed him. Unfortunately, we never see Mordo develop into a full-fledged villain in the MCU. At least we haven't seen that yet, which is honestly a bit of a letdown. I'm not going to hold that against this movie, but I do think it is one of the biggest missed opportunities of the MCU overall. Yes, Mordo is in Doctor Strange 2, but his role there is a bit unique, and that's not a spoiler, by the way, because we do see him in a trailer, and I'm just going to leave it at that for now. We'll talk more about that in the review of the sequel, which will be coming out soon. But yeah, I am kind of hoping that, Mordo does develop into more of a full-fledged villain, later on, and we do see him come back when we pick up that storyline, because, the storyline with him has kind of been one of those loose ends that I don't think has been tied up, particularly well at all in the MCU. So hopefully, he has a bigger presence later on. But again, his role in this film is perfectly fine, and I do think it's kind of interesting that, you see in this movie Stephen Strange, going from having no faith in the mystic arts to becoming a full-fledged believer in the mystic arts and, eventually becoming Sorcerer Supreme. Whereas Mordo kind of has the inverse character arc, where, he has absolute faith in the mystic arts and the Ancient One at the beginning of the film, and eventually he ends up losing that faith, by the end of the film. So that's kind of an interesting contrast there. Steven ends up gaining faith and Mordo ends up losing his faith. Very interesting there, and very good storytelling too. And it's also another reason why I do want to see more with the Mordo character and his relationship with Stephen Strange in future films. Anyways, the film ends with Strange and Wong going to the New York Sanctum to defend the world from all threats mystic. And that's Doctor Strange for you. Doctor Strange was a real treat of a film. Definitely one of my favorites. I would definitely put it into the top 10 MCU films. I just love the origin story of Doctor Strange. It's one of my favorite origins in all of comic books. And as much as these special effects are a visual appeal for the film, the heart of the story is Stephen Strange's character development. I don't really know how much more I can really stress that point as much as I did earlier in the review. The transition from materialistic skeptic to believing and dedicated student of the mystic arts to Sorcerer Supreme is so compelling to me as someone who strives for spiritual and philosophical development myself, and it's why he's one of my favorite comic book heroes. And finally, Benedict Cumberbatch, does a phenomenal job bringing the character to life. I can't imagine anyone else playing this role, to be honest. So yeah, I love this movie. I think it adapted the character and his origin pretty well. Definitely one of my favorite MCU films. It does have a couple of issues, but overall a fantastic movie. Really love this one. That being said, is Doctor Strange 2 a worthy sequel to this film? Find out soon when I upload my review of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Until then, be sure to like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, follow me on Twitter, and check out my gaming channel, both of which are linked down below. That being said, this is Jessica James, signing out.